Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're going to be talking about how to best use gamification in science communication when talking about climate change. So we're joined by the lovely Sam Illingworth, who's going to be talking to us about the best ways to do it. I'm Hannah Lacey. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm a public engagement and science communication professional who's running the program Climate Change in a Box. And the whole concept is we have the answer to climate change in this box, but what are we willing to lose to get that answer? So thank you so much for joining us, Sam. It's great to have you digitally here with us.
Thanks, Hannah. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. So we're just going to jump straight in then. So you've had a lot of experience when it comes to designing games and gamification of science communication. Just a wild curveball off the top of your head there. Is there any particular game that you're really proud of, or that is your favourite game
that I've made?
Yeah.
I guess probably the best game that I've made is one that, so I do a lot of my work with my colleague Paul Wake from Manchester Metropolitan University, and the last game we developed is a game called Carbon City Zero World Edition, and I really like that game. The reason being that is part of a much longer gaming dialogue that's been going on for a couple of years, and it really taught us about the power of co-creation. So a lot of my actual research is about developing dialogue between scientists and non-scientists, giving voice to underserved, underheard audiences, but doing so not as a box ticking exercise, but because actually having diversity is how we come up with innovative solutions that not a bunch of old white guys are going to have the only answers to, right? So it was really interesting because during this process, I was like, oh, actually, yes, we are going to listen to everyone and everyone's opinions in creating this game. And we made this initial game, Carbon City Zero, which was basically a cards game where people had to compete to become the world's first carbon zero city. And the feedback we got was, this is great, but why is it a competitive game? Like, shouldn't we be collaborating? And Paul and I were like, we don't actually have an answer to that. Let's just make a new version of the game. So it was great because, like, for us, it was a really powerful reminder of why we should listen to other communities. And I think what this whole process has really taught us is that actually games design is a perfect example, and playtesting is a perfect example of co-creation in action. You know, co-creation is this huge buzzword that lots of people use. Not entirely sure everyone fully understands what's meant by it, or that they're using it in its most generous term. But when you're designing a game, it is a co-creative process. Like, every game has gone through at least several rounds of playtesting. And what I think we did with this game is we took it a stage further, and we literally said to the community, how can we make this better? We're really willing to listen to you. And we took a bit of not a risk, but we really opened ourselves up to that. We responded to it, and the game is immeasurably better. So a very long-winded answer to your question there, but yeah, Carbon City Zero World Edition is probably the game I'm most proud of for those reasons.
That's really interesting how you went from that kind of competitive versus actually to a more collaborative game style. And I think that is that speaks quite well to the subject matter itself, that, you know, we aren't competing against each other to, you know, work on reducing carbon emissions. We are,
Absolutely.
you know, everyone has their own piece to play in this. So thank you. That's really interesting to know that's kind of your favorite game. So that leads us really nicely into sort of the first few questions I've got. And this is really looking at the best practice on what people can do when looking at using games to design science communication and public engagement activities. And what do you think are the key things that we need to take into consideration before we start doing this process of turning a concept into a game?
No, definitely. I mean, I wonder if I might be slightly objectionable is the wrong word, but I don't know if I agree with the term gamification, only because I think that gamification in game studies parlance maybe has some negative connotations attached to it, as in it's this idea of let's turn everything into a game that's got, like, perfect example being, like mindfulness apps. Like, in order to get my mindfulness for the day, I have to get this number of points in order to do that, which is kind of not really tapping into an element of mindfulness. Similarly, we get to see a lot of politicians, civil servants, etc., trying to turn things into games through gamification that doesn't necessarily need to be turned into a game. I think a phrase that I prefer is maybe purposeful play. So this idea that we're encouraging people to be playful and to play a game, to elicit dialogue, to communicate information, to generate two-way conversations. And I think that games afford us a really fantastic opportunity for doing that. Both video games and tabletop games, analog games. I'm far more au fait with the use of tabletop games in this particular way, and I think that the reason for that is manifold. But one of the real reasons is that when you sit down to play a tabletop game with someone, when you do so, you negotiate a series of contracts with the players, which means that dialogues can take place at the tabletop that might not be possible away from the tabletop. So, when we're engaging non-scientists when scientists are engaging non-scientists, there's actually loads of expertise, tacit and lived experience that the non-scientists can bring to the table, but which sometimes are difficult to extract because of hierarchies of intellect that can become established with who's the expert, who's the non-expert, air quotes. Whereas when we sit down to play a game, we almost forget about those hierarchies that exist beyond the gaming table and renegotiate our contracts at the gaming table. So if we're playing, for example, a game like King of Tokyo, where the aim is to you're a monster trying to kill the other monsters and take control of Tokyo City, it's perfectly permissible for me to destroy you with laser beams and gamma ray bursts, which is behavior that you would hope is not acceptable away from the gaming table. But in negotiating those contracts, we've created a new environment, a new safe space. In gaming terms parlance, we call it the magic circle, in which dialogues can take place that might not ordinarily happen away from the gaming table. So this idea of, purposeful play can really help to facilitate those dialogues.
I think that's really interesting, you're saying about this sort of contract exchange. That seems to be something that's done sort of without thinking. I suppose you wouldn't sit down with the players around the table and be like, okay, this is us in real life, this is us in the game, and this is how our relationships and the way we interact have changed. It's all kind of done with this subconscious.
Absolutely. I mean, and Bernard Suits, the games philosopher, talks about this in his book Grasshopper, that really by even playing a game, we've decided to negotiate a contract, right? Because in many instances, when we play a game, it has no real world impact, positive or negative, and we're abiding by a set of arbitrary rules to achieve something that, again, in real world space is arbitrary. So we've put ourselves into this mindset of negotiating contracts, like you say, without necessarily thinking about it, which is a really great way of, catching people in a way that maybe makes them more malleable for dialogue to take place.
And do you think that's one of the key benefits of having this sort of exploration of something through play rather than other methods?
Absolutely. And I think just bringing people together, right? And it's that exploration that it doesn't have to be too serious. It can be something that's fun. It can be something that's enjoyable, and it can be about very serious topics, but it can really be done in a way that people want to engage with it as well.
Do you think there's a concern or any considerations that need to be made if you are discussing really serious topics within these game spaces and these play spaces? Do you think we run a risk of sort of reducing the severity or the real world mean of the topic?
I don't think so. I think there's maybe more of a risk, like ethically, that it might elicit certain trigger warnings with certain audiences, you know, certainly. I mean, and I'm not just talking about like really difficult conversations with specific audiences. You know, for example, if we're talking about like end of life care with palliative audiences, like obviously that's something that needs very, very serious ethical concerns. But even something like climate change, right? Like there's a huge amount of grief that's kind of just there in the background that people don't necessarily identify with. Same with COVID. You know, there's going to be lots of, I think, long-term PTSD issues associated with these subjects. There's lots of great work on this in climate change, with climate change grief. And I think that sometimes, because we're unable to conceptualize or localize or think about that problem in our day-to-day lives, when we do so through something like games, it can actually elicit feelings that we might not ordinarily have. So I think that there needs to be very careful ethical considerations, safeguarding put in place, etc., for how we might deal with that when that happens, when that takes place. I guess to get back to your point, I see one of the challenges I face, certainly when I'm using games with my students, is they don't necessarily think it's sensible or for real. You know, so it's like, oh, we're playing games today. Do I need to come into that session? And it's like, no, look, games are just another way of exploring the medium. Just like I'd ask you to read a case study or a text or watch a film or listen to a dialogue. This is just a different way that we're going to explore the topic. But that needs to be very carefully foregrounded with certain audiences, as with many other subjects as well, for exactly this reason, that people might think it can be reductionist. But I actually find the complete opposite, that actually it opens up very, very empathetic and meaningful conversations. Maybe once people have got past that initial, oh, hold on, games are just something to mess about with. I think that they're so much more than that.
That's really interesting, that actually there's not just potential audience reactions to using the game format to communicate these topics, but actually from, I'm assuming when you say students, you do mean sort of students that are studying science and science communication. So more maybe what we'd class the professional side of the table. And do you think that that's a barrier to more people using this method?
100%. I mean, and yeah, absolutely, Hannah. Like not just students, but like science professionals, science communication professionals as well. I'd say science communication professionals are pretty good at like trying new things and wanting to experiment. But you know, as my other side of my research is poetry, and I think people find it's not just that people might not find it sensible, it's also that it can alienate certain audiences as well, because people might not think, oh, games aren't for me, poetry isn't for me. So sometimes it's either about foregrounding how it's going to be used, or just not mentioning the fact that there's going to be games involved, right? And then surprising people with it and using that as a way, oh, and then people can come away with that in a really positive way. But, you know, as with all good science communication, understanding audiences' needs and experiences beforehand, developing that dialogue is much more important.
Do you think there's a particular style of game, like we mentioned back at the beginning, the kind of collaborative rather than competitive? Is there a particular one that you find works quite well? Obviously, as you said, you've got to tailor it to the audience, but is there a particular style that actually has a really good working method?
I mean, it's such a good question, but like the thing that me and Paul have really discovered in our work is that you need to really carefully think about the constraints that are available for you, right? So like, first of all, like how much time have you got available? Secondly, like what physical space do you have? Like I've got games in my library that literally take an entire like university seminar room to play, like literally, like crazy. But then also gaming literacy, you know, we talk so much about scientific literacy and not alienating our audience with terms that we've been au fait with for 20, 30 years ourselves. Same with gaming literacy. You know, I've played games a long time. I can, games that I find easy, other people will find very complex. I'm not super intelligent. It's just that I've been playing games a long time. So I'm able to, I know many mechanics. I'm able to learn systems very quickly. So I don't think there's necessarily an ideal game for every audience. It's more about what are your constraints and how can you find a game that fits in with those constraints? And that's a really interesting challenge. One thing that I think does work really well is if you're playing a competitive, like collaborative games are great because there's a lot of peer-to-peer learning that can take place. So if one person knows the rules reasonably well, everyone can learn. It's a much more enjoyable experience. But a good way of getting around that is if you've got a competitive game, something that we've been doing that works really nicely is doubling people up. So everybody, like if it's like a 4-player game, turn it into an 8-player game, but have 2 people in each person. That means that you can like have a conversation, like learn the rules together. The downtime, so like the time in between plays, is less boring for people because they continue to have a conversation. So that's a really good tip that we've learned. But I think that I don't think there is an ideal game. I think it's really about understanding your audience's needs, experiences, expectations, having the knowledge of what games exist, and then marrying the two up and trying them out.
That's really interesting, that idea of the game literacy. You know, games are something that we have normally played since we've been children, and maybe tend not to carry too much into adulthood as much as we did when we were younger. But that's very interesting that that can be an alienating factor for people. I suppose one example is if you were to ask me to play Dungeons and Dragons, I wouldn't have a clue. But if you were to stick me on something like Candy Crush, you know, pretty quick to pick it up. So it's interesting that you really have to think about not just how you're interacting with these audiences in terms of the science communication and making it an equitable engagement in those aspects, you know, making it somewhere where the audience are comfortable to go to and to be there to engage, but actually, you know, are they aware on how to play this game? Is this going to be a really off-putting factor?
That's like absolutely, it's like one of the biggest things we've learned over the past few years, definitely. And like, you know, the amount of when we started off very early on, taking games that we love and we're just like cringing about it, like looking back on it, like, you know, this game would take 3 hours to play and like an hour to explain, and it just doesn't make sense. And then that can really then put people off games going forward. I mean, the Dungeons and Dragons example you give is a really good one, but actually I think if you were to play Dungeons and Dragons, which is something you're completely new to, you'd actually pick up quite fairly quickly. Where we have real problems is if we've got a game that's like card games, right? Like Carbon City Zero is a good example. It uses a mechanic called deck building, which is basically the idea that you're trying to create your own deck of cards that is better than the deck of your opponents, basically. But it has mechanics in it that seem familiar. Like, let's say you're a bridge player or a poker player, but are actually very different. So thinking back to games that we played as a child, actually that knowledge, again, is where we try to impart learning that we've already got. I guess in video games, you call it grokking. Like that, you're trying to grok something using a different set of rules, which can actually make it even more complex. So sometimes bringing a game that's really different to what people have ever experienced before is much better. Just as with jargon with scientific literacy, right? Like if I use a brand new word that people haven't experienced before, but define it, that's sometimes much safer than using a word that different people have different connotations with and different assumptions with. You know, like, so like a long time period is something that meteorologists and paleontologists and other publics would have very different understandings of, same as a card game. Whereas if I was to tell you we were going to play a dexterity game, which is where you kind of flick things across a table, that's very different. It's like, oh, this is a new thing I need to learn in a new way. So I don't try and grok it. I think it's GROK. I don't try and grok it. I just learn this new thing. So yeah, really thinking about that is very, very important.
And it's kind of that sort of what I'm getting from that is it's trying to keep it simple in terms of context, not making it too difficult. You know, when you said it, if it's taking 2 hours or 3 hours to play, but an hour to explain, that's a lot for people to take in. How do you balance that with embedding what can sometimes be quite complex messages about scientific research?
So I think a lot of that can, again, it's really about thinking about the whole session that's available to you. And I think the best times is where you've got like the opportunity to have a debrief as well. So you're introducing the game, you're playing the game, and then you're talking to people about the conversations that it elicited afterwards as well. So, you really need quite a sizable amount of time in order to do that. And so that's really, really important. But I would say that debrief's kind of essential. It doesn't necessarily need to be long, but at least talking to people about, and it's not to say you need to have, this is a one right way of thinking, this is a wrong way of thinking, but it's just what dialogues took place, how did that contextualize with that scientific topic, etc. And I guess again, one of the things we learned was that the best way to do that through games is to design games where it's the mechanics rather than the text that are conveying information. Because when you play a game, you don't read the text necessarily. You tend to play the game pattern match, etc. So if you're learning through the mechanics rather than having to rely on reading flavor text, that can be a more powerful way of imparting information or generating dialogues.
So that's the more kind of, I am doing this as my action in the game to have this outcome, and having the science embedded within that bit rather than the wider narrative. Would that be a fair
Yeah, I think that's a
summary?
fair outcome. Yeah, I think that's fair, definitely.
And have you found that there's any particular areas of science, if we're taking a step back and looking at research as a whole rather than just, I'm conscious I've used the word science research a lot, looking at it at the wider picture of thinking about all the different things we could be communicating, is there a particular one that lends itself quite well to this style of sort of learning through
Mm.
play?
I honestly think like all research topics, like across UK, like in the UK, across UKRI research, not just the sciences, the arts, the humanities, etc., lend themselves really nicely to this, because I guess the two ways of doing it, like either using a commercially off the shelf available game and adapting it to have that dialogue, that might, it's not necessarily limiting, but you might need to be creative with the games that you're picking. But you can definitely do that. And certainly for literature, certainly for humanities, it's probably easier than the sciences to do that. But again, that requires quite a large knowledge of gaming, of games that exist. But if you're talking about making a game, designing a game, then it's any subject, right? Not for two reasons. One, the people who play it, in two ways rather, the people who play that game, but then also the people who are involved in the play testing and maybe the co-creation of that game as well. So there's not a single subject where you couldn't do something that would elicit dialogue around that research topic. I don't think.
It's all just about taking your subject knowledge of what you want to communicate, thinking of your audience and the time you've got and all the other
Exactly.
sort of aspects, to then, you'll go maybe from 5 ideas down to one that actually have some potential success.
Exactly. I mean, and I
So
think
that's
the real power of games is as a research methodology, right? Like not necessarily that, something like a World Cafe or forum theatre or a citizens assembly, you could make an argument you could have for any research topic, right? Because it's a methodology. And I think it's the same for designing games and creating games. And that's something that Paul and I really wanting to further develop dialogue around, the use of games as a research methodology as well as a research output as well.
that's very interesting. That seems like it's leaning more towards sort of the social science and the behaviour change and how people interact, and using that to gather research data, rather than the potential other end of the scale where you're going, this is my research, this is my outcomes, this is how I engage this particular audience with it.
Exactly.
I think that'd be interesting. Yes, I can definitely see there's a growth there. I suppose it's a bit like using public dialogue as a way of engaging with audiences, and that whole level of co-design and co-creation in terms of public engagement and science communication. That's been really, really lovely. I'm going to be interested to see kind of where that work goes. I think just as we're coming towards the end of the session here, it'd be really great to understand if you had kind of a top 3 is always quite a good number. A top 3 list of things that people really need to consider or have in mind before they even start looking at taking their science research or any research into this game and play space to communicate with audiences?
Yeah, of course. So I'd say top three things in this order would be: one, consider your topic. So like, what is it that you're trying to elicit dialogue around? Or in some instances, what specific piece of information are you trying to convey? Because, you know, I'm all about two-way dialogue and participation, but I also do still think there's a role for the deficit model in some instances. You need to be able to transfer information in one direction in some cases, in many instances, so that people can then be upskilled and informed so dialogue can take place. So like, what is it that you're trying to convey? Are you trying to convey a specific factoid, or are you trying to create an environment in which dialogue can take place around a topic? Number two, consider your audience. Like, obviously, this is completely key to science communication more generally. Move away from this idea, as thankfully many people are, of a general public, which doesn't exist, and instead think about which publics are we trying to engage with? What is it about them that makes them unique? Why do you want to engage with them? Do you have someone like a member of that public that you can start talking with in the first instance? So that'd be the first two. And then the third would be play a load of games. Like, just play games that you enjoy, and then think about, okay, this is a game, commercially available game that I like. How could I potentially adapt this, hack this, modify this to make it something that can elicit that dialogue? Because the great thing about tabletop games over video games is, if I want to hack a video game, like AAA video game, I need to be an amazing coder, right? And probably need a team of like 100 people. If I want to go and hack a tabletop game, I need a pen and a paper, like, and me. So they're amazing for doing that. And in doing so, you can also really learn about games design, game mechanics. So yeah, those three things: think about your topic, think about your audience, and then think about play a load of games, and think about which of those games you might in the first instance modify or hack in order to start eliciting dialogue around your chosen research topic.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Sounds like a great excuse when we are eventually allowed back out into the world and to go into public places after sort of COVID. Sounds like a good excuse to go to a games cafe and spend an afternoon, to be honest.
Absolutely.
So that'd be brilliant. Thank you so much, Sam. It's been really great to talk to you about this and sort of learn more about how to use play and the use of games to talk about research topics and engage audiences in this way. It's been great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Hannah. You're very welcome.